In my presentation, I would like to address the connection between real and financial openness by drawing on a special chapter on globalization in this year's annual report. As we know, in debates about globalization, there is a tendency to draw a sharp distinction between real and financial globalization. But it turns out that drawing a sharp distinction is very difficult. Indeed, real globalization entails a substantial degree of financial globalization. But having said that, it is also true that the global financial system is subject to procyclicality and excesses, just like the domestic financial system, as Jaime explained earlier. And some measures of financial openness tend to move in step with financial excesses as well. There are some useful lessons, and perhaps the most important lesson is that a resilient financial system is the best way to ensure the durable benefits from globalization. To begin with, let's review some facts. Suppose we define trade openness as the sum of exports plus imports over GDP, and measure financial openness as the sum of external assets and external liabilities over GDP. Now, there's a question about whether these are the right measures of real and financial openness, but we can come back to this later. These charts from the annual report show how financial openness relate to trade openness on the left-hand panel and GDP per capita on the right-hand panel. On the left-hand panel, you see that there is an upward-sloping relationship between trade openness and financial openness, but we see that the advanced economies are more financially open, even when controlling for the level of trade openness or indeed GDP per capita. So the advanced economies are represented by the red dots. When we plot the ratio of financial openness to trade openness over time, and here I refer to the right-hand panel, the advanced economies started to diverge from the emerging economies in the 1980s. And the ratio of financial openness to trade openness now stands at roughly double that of the emerging market economies. Another notable fact is that the driver of trade openness has been the trade in manufactured goods, as shown by the gray bars in this chart, which is scaled to world GDP. In turn, as Claudio has mentioned, the growth in manufactured goods trade reflects the growing importance of global value chains, especially those involving emerging economies. The two blue shaded areas show the weight of the global value chains involving emerging market economies. You see how this has been growing over the last 20 years or so. And global value chains provide a good illustration of the close link between real and financial globalization. And let me illustrate it with this small example. Suppose we have a multinational car manufacturer with plants in 3 locations. In the first stage, the firm makes engines in Japan, say, and ships it to its plant in Canada. In the second stage, in Canada, the firm adds the chassis and transmission and sends it to its plant in Mexico. And there, the car is finished and is ready to be shipped to dealers. Now, at any one date, the firm has intermediate goods being shipped across the world. There is the engine in Japan, the half-finished car in Canada, and the finished car in Mexico. These are the inventories of the firm. Now, some of you may have read Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And in that book, the CEO of the logistics company UPS is quoted as saying, "When our grandfathers owned shops, Inventory was what was in the back room. Now it is a box 2 hours away on a package car, or it might be hundreds more crossing the country by rail or jet, and you have thousands more crossing the ocean. Now, the picture of boxes whizzing around the world is a marvel not only of modern technology and transport, but also of modern finance. And this is because these boxes are the inventories of the firm. And on the balance sheet, they enter as assets of the firm. And as with any other asset, inventories must be financed somehow. And typically, firms dip into their own working capital resources or borrow short-term from banks to finance their working capital. So let's think about how the balance sheet of the firm reflects these financing demands. To begin with, the engine needs to be carried on the balance sheet. On the balance sheet, the value is V, let's say. And the inventory could be financed with short-term debt, here indicated in pink. When we get to date 2, the firm has the half-finished car being shipped across the sea. And this is a more valuable item because it reflects 2 lots of value added. Say that this has value 2V. Now, together with the engine in Japan, the total financing need is 2V plus 1V. At date 3, the firm has 3 lots of inventories with total value of 3 plus 2 plus 1. And short-term debt in pink would need to be that much larger. Now, you can see that the financing need of the firm increases very fast as the length of the chain grows. If the chain has 4 stages, then the total financing need would be 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. And this is the arithmetic series, or the area of the triangle, which is half the area of the square. So the total financing need is growing at the rate of the square of the length of the chain. So another way of saying this is that the financing need is nonlinear and is a convex function of the length of the chain. So when the global value chain is already very long, a lengthening entails much higher financing needs. If the global value chain crosses the boundary of the firm, then rather than inventories, the firm will have accounts receivable being financed with accounts payable and with short-term debt. But the principle is the same. The working capital demands of exporting firms are increasing very rapidly with the length of the global value chain. Now, this example is a very simple one for illustration. And in practice, the global value chains will be longer and involve many more branches and sub-branches. Firms managing their global value chains are like jugglers with many balls in the air. The balls are of different shapes and sizes. Some of them will be heavy, as they represent almost finished products of high value. And long and intricate global value chains mean that there are many balls in the air at the same time, meaning greater financial resources to knit the production process together. In this context, looser financing conditions are like weaker gravity for the firm's juggling, for the juggler. When the financing conditions are loose, the firm juggling so many balls in the air finds that it can throw more balls in the air at the same time and manage to juggle them at little financial cost. But when the financial conditions tighten, it is more difficult to keep so many balls in the air at the same time. The large balls become especially heavy. Normally, it is banks that supply this financing, and very often in dollars. Close to half of all manufactured trade is invoiced in dollars, as Jaime mentioned earlier. If financing conditions become less easy and banks pull back dollar funding, some global value chains will no longer be economically viable. And this may explain why a stronger dollar has not led to higher exports by emerging market economies. A stronger dollar is generally associated with tighter dollar financing conditions. The example of the global value chain shows how difficult it is to draw a sharp distinction between real and financial globalization. The financing of international trade is a small part of global finance, but it is only the beginning of a cascade of financial relationships that follow. For exporting firms, if the product is invoiced in dollars, such as for oil firms, it makes sense to borrow in dollars to finance real investment. Indeed, we have seen substantial dollar bond issuance of large emerging market economy oil firms in recent years. But the cascade of financial relationships go much further. Take the perspective of advanced economy asset managers. They have obligations to domestic beneficiaries or policyholders in yen, euros, or Swiss francs, but any diversified global portfolio of assets will have a large representation of dollar assets, precisely because borrowers have borrowed in dollars. These asset managers will then hedge the currency risk, but the counterparty is a global bank, which will then need to lay off the currency risk. And it can do so by borrowing dollars, as the short dollar position will counteract the long dollar position from their hedging services. So in this way, new financial claims cascade from the real economy transactions. You can see from this list that it is not easy to draw a line between financing in support of the real economy and pure financial globalization. So what are the aggregates? So this slide shows the total cross-border assets and liabilities of the BIS reporting banks denominated in US dollars. The upward bars are cross-border assets in dollars, and the downward bars are the cross-border liabilities in dollars. The left-hand panel classifies the cross-border lending and borrowing by location, the place of business, while the right-hand panel is by nationality, the location of the headquarters. So for example, if a French bank in London lends dollars to an Asian corporate, it is captured in the yellow for the UK on the left-hand panel, but in blue for the euro area on the right-hand panel. You can see that from the two panels that they're quite different. The purple is Swiss banks, for example. And in general, European banks and euro area banks, in particular, have been very important in dollar intermediation. So another way of putting it is that the difference between these two panels reflect the inter-office positions, meaning the lending and borrowing between headquarters and the affiliates, the branches and the branches and subsidiaries of these banks. And we'll come back to inter-office positions in a moment. But before that, I'd like to make a more general point about the accounting framework for international finance. Imagine that we have a European bank lending dollars to an Asian corporate through its branch in Asia. And suppose that the European bank raises dollars in New York by tapping a money market fund there. Then its liabilities are in New York, its assets are in Asia, but it's a bank headquartered in Europe. So where is the bank? Well, its assets it's in all three places, or perhaps none. But in balance sheet space, we can understand this much better. And once we have the totals in global aggregates, again, things are much more transparent. Now, the traditional approach to international finance is to treat each country as an island. We measure GDP on each island, and the trade balance determines the external assets and liabilities. But in practice, we need to be thinking more of a matrix of interlocking balance sheets. And the matrix does not respect geography, as we've just seen. The mapping between the nodes of the network to the islands is not a neat one. But by aggregating the global total, allows us to track the overall picture, and this is why the BIS has put so much weight on the global liquidity aggregates. And this brings us to the debate on deglobalization, which we cover in depth in the special chapter in the annual report. Now, you're aware that there is a debate about peak finance, which is the claim that the world has seen peak global finance, and financial deglobalization has begun. The proponents of peak finance point to the decline in cross-border banking as evidence. The left-hand panel here, taken from the annual report, does indeed show a decline since the crisis. Cross-border claims declined from a peak of around 60% of global GDP in 2007 to less than 40% recently. But cross-border bank claims can be misleading for the same reason that the islands view of the global economy misleads. If a bank lends to an Asian company by first shifting funds to its London branch, then there would be double counting of that loan amount to the ultimate borrower in the cross-border banking statistics. That's because that loan amount shows up twice as it hops across the islands. And so if we look at this chart, the inter-office positions, which is the top layer in blue, would be capturing that double counting, and you can see that the double counting is very substantial. It's a very substantial part of the total. The pink is the bank-to-bank lending, and the yellow is the bank to non-bank lending cross-border. A more informative measure of lending to final borrowers comes from the consolidated banking statistics, which measures positions at the group level. To get the full picture, we can net out the inter-office positions, but then we need to add back the local positions of an affiliate, as they would not show up in the cross-border banking statistics. And the resulting total is known as foreign claims and is shown here on the right-hand panel. The dark blue layer at the top are the foreign claims of euro area banks. The light blue are the foreign claims of other European banks, the yellow Japanese banks, and the pink US banks. And looking at this consolidated chart, it's quite clear that the shrinkage of international banking is largely confined to European headquartered banks. The other banking systems actually increased foreign claims as a proportion of world GDP. So in sum, the lesson is not that financial globalization has stalled. Rather, the banks headquartered in Europe are continuing their consolidation after the crisis. So the story is more of cyclical consolidation after a previous unsustainable expansion, rather than a shift in the trend. By distinguishing the trend from the cycle, we see that globalization has not been in headlong retreat. Nevertheless, the right-hand panel also underscores the fact that the global financial system is subject to procyclicality, just as the domestic financial system is. And financial crises cast a long shadow on the global economy for years at a time. And the lesson is that ensuring a resilient financial system is the best way to reap the benefits of real globalization. So let me conclude. We have seen that it is indeed exceedingly difficult to draw a sharp distinction between real and financial globalization. Real globalization entails a substantial amount of financial globalization. But having said that, it is also true that the global financial system is subject to procyclicality and excess, just like the domestic financial system. And ensuring a resilient financial system is the best way to reap the benefits of globalization. And as Jaime described earlier, international cooperation toward resilience is as important as ever. And finally, from a more methodological point of view, we need to transcend the island's view of the global economy toward that of a matrix of interlocking balance sheets.
Thank you.